I just want to point out to you something you may have already noticed, but you will notice, is that in these videos, sometimes the slide numbers jump around a little bit and might not match what you're seeing in your slides. And that's because making the videos takes a long time. And so once I make a video, I don't usually want to remake it. When I want to change it, I edit the old video. And sometimes we end up with the wrong slide numbers. But it's best to use the videos that say already what I want to say. So this is one of those. So you'll see the slide numbers jump around a little bit, and you'll probably notice that in a lot of other videos. And it's just what it is. We start with a very big question. Why are microorganisms small? And no one knows. We can't ask microorganisms why they are so small, and even if we could, they wouldn't know. It's like asking us, why do we have 2 legs? Why do we have 2 legs? Nobody knows. But biologists answer these questions through the lens of evolution. We say, well, in the understanding of modern science, any living thing is the way it is because evolution has pushed it to be that way, because organisms with those traits were successful in the past and they were able to reproduce and have offspring with those traits. And so we can think about small size of microorganisms through the lens of evolution. So we have kind of 3 different evolutionary hypotheses, and they don't disagree with each other. They could all be true, or none of them could be true. So the first one is the ratio of surface area to volume, and I'll explain this in the next slide. Another is diffusion of signaling molecules, and I will again explain this in the next slide. The last one is reproduction rates. So small sizes mean that it doesn't take long for bacterial cells to grow big enough to divide. And once they divide, they've gone through an entire generation, and they can mutate as they go through that process. And in the process of mutation, they can introduce genetic variability into a population that allows evolution to happen. It allows natural selection to happen. So the small sizes allow them to reproduce quickly, exploit new niches, and evolve quickly. So let's get into these first 2 that I didn't explain. The first one is the surface area to volume ratio, or the ratio of surface area to volume. And so we first talk about a cell's volume. So like how much cytoplasm is in a cell. And this correlates to how much a cell weighs, so its mass, but also its demand for nutrients. How many enzymes does it have inside itself? How quickly does it need to make new proteins? That all correlates to its size to some extent. And so if we think of a sphere, the volume of a sphere is, 4/3 pi r cubed, where r is the radius of the sphere, or the radius of a cell. So let's keep that in mind. That's how we calculate the volume of a sphere. And a sphere, and the volume roughly correlates to the cell's demand for nutrients. Then surface area. What does surface area correlate to? Well, remember that any kind of cell gets nutrients across its membrane. Nutrients have to cross a cell membrane to come in, and waste products have to cross the cell membrane to go out. And in many cases, the cell surface area is going to control how quickly that can happen. It's going to limit how many transport proteins there can be. It's going to limit how much passive diffusion there can be. So the surface area of a cell determines how quickly nutrients can enter and how quickly waste can exit. So we can calculate the surface area of a sphere at 4 pi r squared. And again, r is the radius of the sphere. So what happens if we make r bigger? So if the cells were bigger, what would happen? And that's what we should look at. Here we can get the ratio of surface area to volume. And again, we can think of it as surface area is the ability to transport chemicals, volume is the need to transport chemicals. So a happy cell has a lot of ability to do what it needs to do. So a happy cell is going to want to maximize its surface area and minimize its volume. And if we look at the ratio of surface area to volume from the formulas on the preceding slide, this is what we get, 3 over R. So as R increases, this ratio is going to get smaller and smaller. As this number gets bigger, this whole ratio gets smaller. So bigger cells have less ability to bring in nutrients and get rid of waste products. So that's that's surface area and volume. We just think that a very small cell has more efficient ability to move the molecules it needs across the membrane. And human cells, we don't really need that because we have a blood supply constantly keeping our cells fed, and other things like that. And most of our cells don't need to swim around and rapidly divide. Most of our cells are not in the process of doing anything like that. So they can be a little bit bigger. But most of our cells their radius would be like 10 times, 20 times bigger than a bacterial cell, not like 100 times or 1,000 times bigger. The last one is diffusion. So how quickly can signaling molecules go from one end of the cell to the other? How quickly could a messenger RNA diffuse from one end of the cell to the other? And so here we could look at other physics stuff and say that the time required for a molecule to move a distance via diffusion is proportional to that distance squared. So if it takes a minute for a molecule to diffuse 1 centimeter, it would take 100 minutes to diffuse 10 centimeters. And that's what this is showing. If a cell gets 10 times bigger, it will take 100 times longer for molecules to diffuse across it. And so a bigger and bigger cell will need to solve a lot of problems related to getting materials from one part of the cell to the other. And yeah, this can be important for all of that. And this is why biologists are kind of amazed at things like motor neurons, which are enormous. And when I learned about motor neurons, my first question was, how do they get messenger RNA all the way to ribosomes at the distal end? How would proteins get to the distal end? How would anything get from one end to the other? Well, the answer is, if it's by diffusion, it won't. It could take, it's on the order of like a century for a molecule to diffuse a meter. So there must be other ways of making it happen, and our motor neurons certainly have those other ways. Right, so diffusion really governs a lot of what happens in cells, and it's a big driver, most likely, of their size. The other is their small size lets them reproduce quickly. So if we're talking about bacteria and archaea, prokaryotes, for them to divide and make new cells, they don't have to do mitosis. They don't have to make a new nucleus. All they have to do is copy their DNA and pull it to 2 different sides of the cell. But they don't have to go through that process of condensing it into chromosomes and paying attention to which chromosome is on which side. They just have 1 chromosome usually, and they're very good at dealing with that. And so a lot of bacteria can reproduce much, much faster than any eukaryotic cell can. And their small size is probably part of why. So I'm going to end this video here. I hope you have thought a little bit about why they are small and how evolution can push them in that direction. One thing we know for sure, evolution is pushing them in that direction, because if it wasn't, by now they would be much bigger.